I think most of you know a little bit about me, but anyway, I'm an evolutionary geneticist. So ordinarily, when speaking to a Rodent Institute event, I would be talking about evolutionary genetics. However, I'm also a professional web programmer and a longtime observer as well as user and maker of the web. So what I want to talk about today is something that has to do with that aspect of my life, which is also relevant, I suspect, to all of your lives too. There's a great deal of hand-wringing these days, and more than hand-wringing, about evils associated with the web and what should be done about them. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the evils themselves to some degree, and also about some of the proposals that are circulating to address them. What are the problems with those proposals, and how might we do better? Right. So to start with, what I'll call the symptoms. I view them as symptoms of deeper disease. There's a great deal of lies and propaganda, including hate speech and misinformation or disinformation on the web. They're particularly prevalent on social media, which I'll use, as many people do, as a shorthand for Facebook, Twitter, and a handful of other popular online services. But these things are present more broadly, including results from search engines and news aggregators like Google. These things contribute significantly, as many people now recognize, to offline evils, including some quite severe evils, such as genocide in Myanmar, for example, and vaccine hesitancy, which is prolonging and intensifying the COVID-19 pandemic. As these evils are mounting, governments are facing growing demands to do something, and they're beginning to respond. Unfortunately, these responses are often naive, and I think, and many other observers think, are likely to lead to enormous amounts of collateral damage, while not necessarily even entirely effectively addressing the evils they seek to address. The proposed remedies, legislation and regulations, tend to focus on the content itself. They demand stronger policing by online services and government agencies. Basically, they say to online services, you must take this content down, either proactively or at least reactively as soon as you become aware of it. In the USA in particular, proposed legislation and regulations tend to expose services for legal liability for content posted by users. At present, online services are generally protected from such liability by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which prevents them from being construed as publishers in the legal and technical sense, who are therefore liable for things users post. There have been some carve-outs to that over the years, but by and large, it still prevails, and it has been formative for the web as we know it. The problem, of course, or perhaps I shouldn't say of course, because it isn't obvious to everyone, but the problem is articulated in a statement I've quoted here by law professor Eric Goldman and law student Jess Mears. The logical consequence of tougher internet laws is clear but chilling. Google and Facebook will likely survive the regulatory onslaught, but few other user-generated content services will. Instead, if they are expected to achieve impossible outcomes, they will shut down all user-generated content. Basically, if the demands for content moderation, as it's usually called, are too heavy and too difficult, the result will be that many services that currently host user-generated content, for example, news sites that allow users to comment on news stories, will conclude it's simply too risky and expensive, and they will shut down those operations. The bigger services like Google and Facebook, which are basically able to print money at this point, will presumably continue to allow user-generated content, but they're likely to impose pretty heavy de facto censorship in order to limit their liability or exposure. So this may have the perverse effect of actually further entrenching these established giants, basically raising the barrier to entry for new services that might effectively compete with them. The involvement of government agencies also raises concerns about freedom of speech. So what I'd like to suggest is that we back up a step and ask what the real problem is here and how we might address it effectively without these forms of collateral damage I've been describing. The main problem with most harmful content isn't that it's publicly available per se. I mean, various forms of harmful content have been available in some form through some venue since time out of mind. The problem is that some of it reaches large and receptive audiences who are galvanized by it and encouraged to do socially undesirable things. And this happens especially when online services actively push content toward users that they expect will find it engaging, whether those users would have sought it out for themselves or not. If you're Facebook or its ilk, engagement is the name of the game, because your business model is basically selling the attention of users to marketers. And so anything that keeps users glued to their screens is good for your business, whether it's good for society or not. For example, here's a quote from an internal memo at Facebook itself that was leaked to the public, concluding that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to our recommendation tools. In other words, Facebook is pushing people toward extremist content. There's quite a bit of other evidence to the same effect. For example, the Markup has done a couple of studies showing that Facebook is systematically pushing users toward Holocaust denial content and toward anti-vax content. If the algorithm, as it's called, thinks you'll find it interesting, it's going to promote it to you. Now, older media do this too in their limited ways, but online services can do it more effectively because they can tailor their content promotion to individual users. And that brings me to what I regard as the disease, which I've described here as peeping marks, as in Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, and Jax, as in Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, and Evans, as in Evan Spiegel, the CEO of Snapchat. Online services can, and some do, track your every move. What you do or don't click, what you do or don't like or favorite, or whatever is supported by the service, how long you spend where, and so on. And they feed such observations into machine learning systems that yield what amount to socioeconomic and psychological profiles of you and other individual users. This kind of profiling, which is performed by a sprawling industry of ad networks and data brokers, is widely used to target advertising and has been widely condemned for the various ill effects that such advertising engenders. But it's important to understand that it's also used, very much so, by Google, Facebook, and others to target so-called organic content. That is, posts by other users, by institutions with institutional accounts, by bots pretending to be users, and so forth. And the social consequences of that kind of targeting may be even worse and are actually what are the main instigators or stimulants to action by governments at present. It should also be noted that besides fueling the spread of harmful content, these invasions of privacy are a major problem in themselves. Most people who know about them don't like them. It's important to understand, though, that a lot of people don't know about them. It's not necessarily obvious when your behavior is being tracked and when that information is being used to change the behavior of a service you're interacting with. That's why I've described it as a disease of peeping marks and so forth. People don't know they're being spied on. Although a lot of people have a suspicion at this point in view of all the publicity around this sort of thing that's happened during the past several years. Nonetheless, a lot of people don't know in much detail what's going on. But when they find out, they usually aren't pleased. So what all of this suggests is that a better remedy might be to stop the surveillance. I would argue that as a general principle, it should always be clear to a user of an online service when they're giving information to the service and what the service may do with it. More specifically, in the words of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, new legislation should require the operators of website to obtain opt-in consent. That is, you have to say, yes, I want you to do this, not opt out, as in, no, please stop doing this, but opt-in consent to collect, use, or share personal data, particularly where that collection, use, or transfer is not necessary to provide the service. And I'll just remark as a footnote, there's reasonable potential exceptions that could be allowed to this for thwarting abuse. Some kinds of information are useful for that, but services should be prohibited from collecting and using that information for any other purpose without user consent. Moreover, I would add, and it's very important, legislation should require operators to explain plainly and honestly what information they want to collect and what they'll do with it if they get it. Right now, services are allowed to get by with very vague, sweeping, you authorize us to collect basically whatever kind of data we want and do with it basically whatever we want. That's what their terms of service look like these days. They shouldn't be able to get away with that. They need to explain in detail what they're going to collect and what they're going to do with it. If necessary, I would suggest that they could even be obliged to use particular language, like the kinds of language that are required on packaging of tobacco products in many countries these days. The point being that research suggests that when people know what's being collected and what's being done with it, most of them don't like it. So they wouldn't opt in if they had the choice. This kind of policy has a number of advantages. I believe, for good reasons, that it probably would substantially inhibit the spread of harmful content. It would not impose burdens on existing or new services that don't engage in surveillance, and therefore that it would not further entrench the established giants. It would not erect new barriers to entry for competitors against them. This kind of policy doesn't raise concerns about free speech. You're not prohibiting anybody from saying anything. And they do address the problem that's posed by the invasions of privacy in themselves, above and beyond the fact that they fuel the spread of harmful content. So, what's not to like here? Well, rest assured, from the perspectives of the established giants, there's plenty not to like. Undoubtedly, Google, Facebook, and their ilk favor regulations focused on the content itself rather than on their sneaky snooping, which is hugely profitable. They can, as Goldman and Mears suggested in the quote I put up earlier, probably withstand the regulatory onslaught if it just consists of telling them that they've got to police the content more aggressively. They will do that as much as possible cheaply and clumsily using shallow and brittle machine learning, something that I've been involved in practicing myself, although hopefully not shallow and brittle to a fault. And they'll also employ vast armies of underpaid people in low-wage countries, as they're already doing. You may or may not be familiar with that, but it's a very ugly underside of the global social media industry at the moment. Anyway, so they favor regulations focused on content rather than snooping. So that's probably what we're going to get at painful cost to our online lives, unless maybe enough of us contact our elected representatives and demand better. Here in Canada on July 29th, the government released a couple of documents setting forth its proposed approach to addressing harmful online content and solicited public comment on them. I read the documents carefully. They're a terrible mess, frankly. They're poorly thought out and would inflict terrible collateral damage if the policies were adopted as set forth, and submitted a comment, long and detailed comment, to the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, which is responsible for this proposal. Shortly, I plan to submit the same document to most members of Parliament, which is about to reconvene after an interstice to allow for the federal election last month. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen. Lots of people need to do it. Knowledgeable people, people with credentials need to do it. Members of Parliament here probably will regard me as just some dude who cares what I think about anything. But hopefully they'll be hearing the same sorts of messages from people who have more status and who will perhaps be able to persuade them to adopt more judicious policies. Anyhow, that's about what I have to say. I hope it's been useful. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.